All right, so I know it's last talk. It's hard. So I have a couple ideas here, and I need to transfer them in your minds, so don't screw this, guys. And yeah, so I guess let's get right to the point. So we focus on some aspects of how we write our code, right? And like, we don't want to repeat ourselves. We don't want coding to be boring. We generally try to make ourselves productive while we write the code. And we also want to make our code reviewable, so you have like less comments on the pull requests, and like people generally love you when you do that. And we also want our code to be maintainable. This is like very related to reviewability, because if it wasn't reviewable before, it's not maintainable after. It's very hard to support it in future. And you know, like we have all this stuff like patterns, like books for that, architectures, principles, different styles of programming, and general common sense that we follow when we write our code, right? And that's great, but we focus on production code. And that's fine, because that's what managers think they pay us for, but actually when it comes to testing and test code, all those principles, for some reason, they just, even the common sense, it goes away. And aren't we like being hypocrite to ourselves? Like, the test code that we write is on the level of the, like junior developer straight from the college. Why is that? It's like, it's stupid. And do we actually understand how much test code we write? And I don't think we do. I don't think we do understand how much time and resources that we put into testing. And like all those things that like productivity, reviewability, those are hard to measure. I'll share some tips in the end of the talk. But there is like a super straightforward metric that can indicate that something is really offset here. So tests can actually take more lines of code than production code. And that's like, what? But it is. So let's take a look at RxJava. It's like the library used by lots of us here, right? If you just measure amount of production code in RxJava, that would be like 82,000 lines of Java code without comments. It's like a lot. Like a lot of big services have less code than that. And if we measure amount of test code there, it would be 159,000 lines of test code without comments. It's like, it's insane. I mean, why would you do that? And well, we do that because we think that's normal for testing. If you think that this is like unique to RxJava, well, I will probably not surprise you or surprise you. It's not at all. It's just depends on how like you want your product to be good and enforce this through testing. It's not really related to RxJava at all. Like if you look at some other projects, like OKHTTP, for instance, it's much smaller than RxJava, but still a pretty big project, like 15,000 lines of production code, but at the same time, 27,000 lines of test code. Again, almost twice. And you think it's only for like big projects. No, retrofit is much smaller, 2,800 lines of production code and 4.9 lines of test code. And for instance, in our projects at Lyft, most of our modules have like pretty, like almost exact same amount of code, or sometimes a little bit more, like in the test code. So it's not really about lines of code, though. It's more why that happens. So there is a pattern there, right? So let's take a look. Is there something in common between all those projects that have some problems with tests? And well, let's take a look at assertion libraries. What they do? We have like assertions from JUnit, we have assertions from assert.j, some bunch of Kotlin libraries with infix functions. Most of them will not save you lines of code, at least. They will just try to make your code cleaner and safer. So assertion libraries usually not the problem here. OK, mocking libraries, right? That's what other tests use. So mocking is also, you have like Makito, EasyMock, PowerMock. Spek has own mocking. But mocking is also pretty fine here. It's not that common, and we prefer to not mock things usually. And many of those libraries actually don't mock anything. But what about test framework itself? Who forces you to write the code that is ugly, that is flat structured, that repeats itself every time, that has like ridiculous function names? They all use JUnit. I'm not going to say that I'm a hater of JUnit. I really like it for many reasons. And it works, and that's very great. And it established the culture of testing in Java community, and now like Kotlin sort of inherited. Okay, inherited is not a good word nowadays. Composed Java community. Okay, so JUnit is like, why do we love it? It's like super hard to misconfigure. It's super straightforward. You see the add test annotation. It's a test, obvious, and like everything. It's a standard. It's a standard in Java community. It's a sort of standard in Kotlin community. And it's OK. I don't think that's like a super huge problem. But this is like one of the main ideas that I want to occur in your brain, that rethink how we write our tests. And JUnit has some problems. So first problem, it's a major one. It's code repetition. It's something that there is a principle that against that. It's like, don't repeat yourself, which you violate every day when you write a test, and you're absolutely fine with that because it seems to be normal, right? So this is a test. I don't expect you to read it because it's JUnit. So this is like ridiculous test name. Then like bunch of stuff happens, and then a couple assertions in the end. OK, here is another test. You see I switch between them. Did you ever like had this moment on the code review, like, did I just read this test twice? Or like, and you scroll back, oh, it's like, that's why, yeah? Well, it's normal. OK, so this is highlighted change. It's like test name, one constant here, and one constant in the assertion. Cool. So this whole test, all lines of it are repeated, which is, I mean, we're fine with this, right? We're going to be productive in the production. OK. Another problem of JUnit is test case and context naming. So this is a real test, and it's definitely not the longest name of the test you can find anywhere, obviously. So it tries to describe what happens in the beginning of tests, and it tries to describe what you're going to assert. Sometimes it also describes what actually else is going to happen in the system while you set the test app, right? I mean, OK, is such a function name is OK in your production code? And like, is a class with a bunch of such functions is OK in your production code? No, it's not. And OK, in Kotlin, we can escape that, right? We can turn it into a sentence, which will only make it worse, to be honest, because it becomes longer because of the spaces. And I mean, it's ridiculous. OK, another problem, very common. On the code review, I ask myself every time I see any test, what is happening here? Another problem of this problem is that when you change your production code and you run the test and test fails, you find yourself like 20 minutes later, what is this actually doing? Like, what is it testing? Because they're like, OK, that's the exact same test with like escape name. It's better, right? So we have 4 assertions here. OK, I mean, and that's sometimes you see tests that test like 12, 10, bunch of stuff in them. And the problem with that is not only you don't have enough context in the name of the test here to understand what you actually are asserting here. But also, if the first assertion fails here, well, you don't know if others are going to pass or not. So you don't have this information up front to understand if it's like I broke the tiny piece of it or I broke like everything. What should I do to like understand what happened, what actually failed? And we usually find ourselves, like when the test fails, I'm not looking at the test name. I'm looking at the stack trace to find, like which class and line it points me to, instead of looking at the test name. Why do we write test names then? Does it matter? Like, can we just put numbers there or something? Like four checks in one test. It's not the biggest one though. Okay. So why do we do that? Because it's a standard, and because it's something that, as a community, we agreed on, right? And like, this is just some test class. Is it maintainable? Is it reviewable? Is it readable? Do you feel productive when you write such tests? It also sort of proves my conspiracy theory that everyone is talking about TDD, but if you would actually write your tests up front, you would start focusing on all those things that you focus in production. So maybe we should do TDD. I don't know. All right. So there is a better way, of course, right? And what I'm going to show is not unique. It's not like an invention. It's just something that some other platforms came to earlier. And because one of the reasons, I think, is because, let's say, Ruby, it was like enforcing TDD on people as a good practice, while Java sort of, and we use JUnit, right? So there is a framework called Spec. Let me give you a short history about Spec. So Spec was started by Hadi Hariri, who is a Kotlin evangelist at JetBrains. In 2012 was the first commit that he obviously failed and redone the project, so we don't really know how long it took him to build it. And 2012 is like 1 or 2 years after Kotlin became public, so it's like a super old Kotlin framework. And I was able to find a runtime jar there from Kotlin, because it looks like at the time we didn't use Maven Central or something. Well, it was Kotlin 0.4. It's like, I'm not sure if there is like any alive library from that moment of past right now, because Spec is still alive. And at that time, turned out you had to explain what Kotlin is in the README. And is Kotlin free to use? It's like, I think that was a time when JetBrains were selling everything to you, probably except Kotlin. And now we are at KotlinConf, which is like very cool. And that was how the first spec looked like in the repository. And that was a function. It's not a functions anymore. And the highlighted spec at the beginning of it is annotation, because at that time, for some reason, I don't know, like maybe they were high, but it's like you don't need add for annotations. Okay. I mean, that will compile on that version of Kotlin. Okay, so fast forwarding this to 2016, I find myself working in a startup where we write everything in Kotlin on the mobile side, with a bunch of people in front here. And we were like, so I joined when they already had some code base, but it wasn't shipped into production. And like, production were changing lots of requirements. We had lots of new features and all that stuff. So, but we were like, we're gonna ship quality, like that's how we win. And so we started to feel all those pains of JUnit, because we had some tests already, lots of them, like thousands, test cases, that we had to change because we were changing the production code. And we were like finding ourselves changing code that repeats everywhere and like all that stuff. It was hard to review, and it was a mess. And me and another colleague were like, okay, we write in Kotlin, and like we should find something better. So we were looking at the variants, and I already knew about Spek by Hadi because it was like I was following him on Twitter. But we found some other options, and like we briefly looked into them, and then like JetBrains, we used their ID. Like why not use JetBrains as Spec? Because it was also like designed for Kotlin from Kotlin people, so why not? So we chose Spec. We started to using it. We started to like file some issues, do some small pull requests to it. And we started massively migrating our existing test cases. Whenever we touch existing test case, we were rewriting it in Spec instead of JUnit, and we were super happy about how productive we felt and how good it felt to write new test cases in Spec. Somewhere in parallel in that time, Hadi was talking to maintainer of another library, and he was like, like with JetBrains, I'm totally faking this, obviously. We were like, JetBrains, like maybe you delete your stuff. We have like very similar library, So after this talk, maintainer of that library became one of the core people in the Spec team, and they started to like do lots of stuff. They broke compatibility right and left. They added new features. They switched from JUnit 4 as an underlying engine to JUnit 5, which was like in release process state and only released like a month ago, but that was like in the beginning of 2000, I think in the middle of 2016 or somewhere there. And then I filed this issue. I remember it as of now. Please fix Spec versioning, compatibility, and publishing, because it was a perfect sample of how you not like follow semantic versioning and break people, and like not put same versions, like you put the version 1.0 on the website, but there is no such version on Maven Central somewhere, and like such issues. So as you can see, this issue is now assigned to myself. It's still open though. I mean, we actually fixed it. We just didn't release the second version yet, which I will cover in the end. So yeah, that man, like, he just grabs someone who can do his work. No, I still love Hadi. He's a great guy. So we're gonna cover Spec 2.x, because if there are users of Spec 1.x, I'm very sorry for all the troubleshooting you had with configuration. That was a little bit complicated, but once you set it up, it was like, wow. Well, in Spec 2.x, we're going to do everything like, wow, hopefully. So it's important to say here that Spec 2.x, and after that, well, it's going to follow semantic versioning, so major version can update, that's fine. It's a foundation for the better future of testing in the whole Kotlin ecosystem. By saying that, I mean that Spec actually a couple weeks ago started to be a multi-platform project. We already have common code that doesn't depend on JVM at all, and we split it into multiple modules, and the structure as of now is that JUnit 5 for us is just a tiny layer that we report to. So we reuse JUnit infrastructure to generate test reports, to like hook into build systems and IDEs, but it's just binding to the JVM tooling and platform, basically. We're gonna support JavaScript pretty soon, because there are like already some bindings to it, and like native and early stages of publishing, so native will be supported as soon as possible as well. And let's take a look at Spec. So this is like very simplified JUnit test case, right? So you have like a test subject. We're going to test calculator. We still test calculator 5 years after in our samples. And we just expect that addition of 2 plus 4 is equal to 6, right? So how would it look like in Spec? I'm going to say here that there are simpler ways to write that spec, but this is like canonical one that I'm gonna hide all the advanced API in this talk. So this is how it will look like in Spec, and as you can see, there is already some structure here, even though we have only one test case. You can make it flat. I'm just encouraging you to have those grouping and structuring to make sense from your tests. And we'll later see why it doesn't make sense. And also, you probably could notice that in the test at JUnit, we had this action that happened inside the test. That actually shouldn't be the part of the test. The reason why we put it in here in JUnit, because when you start adding other test cases, your actions are different, right? So it's kind of hard to make them, to make some code sharing in JUnit. And nesting is, in general, hard in JUnit, even in JUnit 5. If you want, I can try to explain how it's done there, but it's basically like a bunch of annotations, and you need to make it discoverable for JUnit. It's a bunch of boilerplate, and you have to declare classes and all that stuff. And in Spec, the test here only has single line. The action is extracted, and we'll touch that later, but you can add more tests for this particular type of action. So let's try to go through the basic API here. So we saw context, right? So what is context? Context is a synonym to describe, a synonym to given, and it basically comes from this specification-based frameworks. But in Spec, we call this a group, and the group is basically a way for you to, let's say, group some amount of tests and attach some action to it. So you can actually think about the group as very close equivalent to test class in JUnit. The difference here with JUnit, though, is that you can nest them naturally. And that what creates the structure in test. That what makes your test not flat, but meaningful and structured. And by properly naming your groups, you're going to have much more information upfront available for you in the test results and outputs everywhere. Like if test failed, you see what was happening. When you read your pull request, you see what is happening. And in JUnit, you can write this when, then, expect something like those specification-like comments in the text of each test, but that's not going anywhere. It's just for you. And while in Spec, this participates in the reporting. So what is it? It equals 6. And it is a perfect place to put assertion or a verification or some sort of comparing expected result with actual result. So this is basically a test. This is direct equivalent to JUnit test. But again, you are able in Spec, by properly grouping and extracting logic, you are able to remove all the noise from the test. And at that startup, we actually have and had all the test cases are single lines, basically, unless you asserting some complex structures that describing it takes more lines than that. So basically, every test is doing only one assertion or verification. And the point here is that it equals to the test in JUnit. But the point here is that on the particular group level, you can have as many tests as you want. And you can think of it imagine you're testing a view controller or a view model, I don't know, whatever. And by clicking on a button, it should open a new screen, okay? But it should also report to analytics. And those will be 2 separate test cases for this particular level of grouping. And what if, in your JUnit test, most likely you will put this 2 assertions in a single test. But what if screen was not opened, but analytics was reported? It's what did I break in my code? Well, Spec will give you this information because every it will be executed no matter if others fail. So that's why. And basically, by properly combining groups and tests, which we allow you to do just because our API is that, you can just create a natural structure. It's like a tree or something. It just grows as you want it to grow. And it's a code. There are no annotations. The only thing we do with reflection is just define all Spec classes, like find your tests. We don't reflect on your tree of tests. We don't need that. It's not JUnit here. And basically, last part of the basic API here that I'm going to cover is this property delegation, which is like by memoized here. So it's a little bit unfortunate for us that if you just declare it as while calculator equals calculator, well, the whole spec is giant lambda, and you just put more lambdas inside of it. So it's just going to be computed once, because that's how Kotlin works, that's how Java works, and like programming works in general. So you will be working across some shared state in your tests. We want to avoid that. We don't want you to do that. And that should, like, if you need that, that should be like considered as very advanced use. Like if your object is very expensive to create, or something like this, or like it performs some action that takes too much time, and you want to share that. So we have this delegate here that is going to be reinstantiated. So this calculator lambda inside, like the lambda body, is going to be invoked for every test before the test, not before it's lazy, but anyway, it's going to be reset for every test case, so you're not sharing any test state, which is pretty important. Yeah, that's basically what it's for. And it has some, like advanced API, so you can reset it when the group ends, not when the test ends. But usually you don't need that, so I consider that advanced API. So let's take a look at some real JUnit test case that we saw before and rewrite it with Spec. So that's our 4 checks test with ridiculous name here that does 4 assertions and only a single action in the beginning. So how do we convert that to Spec? Well, we're going to start by extracting this action out of the test. That's what is important for making tests readable and maintainable. So we're just going to declare a group that will have a meaningful name that you can look in the report and understand what happened here. Also, what's cool is that it's just a bunch of Kotlin code, so that's just a string. So you can use like string interpolation if you want. It's like everything is available there. So OK, we declare this group. How do we perform an action? Well, we have like before each test, which is direct equivalent to add before in JUnit, that is going to be executed for every test inside this group, no matter how deep it is in the structure. So we're just going to make our action here. And you can see that there is like direct relationship between the group name and the action. That's what ideally you should have. It's like remove access token is a group name, and you remove an access token. Like it makes sense when you look at that. Thank you, Keynote. All right, that's fine. So we have 2 assertions after that, right? So they are currently in a single JUnit test. That is something we want to refactor. You would not probably do this in your production code. Why should you in tests? So we're going to start by extracting something common between them. They just, like take first element from some list, I suppose. So we're just going to have another group inside of first group. And the reason for that is just to have some meaning in the test. It's totally optional. You can omit that if you want, but I'm just trying to make some sense from that test. So I'm declaring this first scope change that we're going to describe here. We're going to describe something that we expect it to be to something that we expected out of it, basically. So in those 2 test cases, we just declare them as 2 separate its in this group. and we just like take this object that is memoized, it's recomputed, it's not shared, and we're just asserting that is like what it is. It equals to some scope that we wanted to, and it's not started. I don't know. I didn't write this code. Just saw it in our repo. So, OK. So the same could be applied for the rest of it. And that's my rough attempt to rewrite the JUnit test to make it more readable. So you can see on the left. The problem here is that once you start adding more test cases that try to do another thing on this particular object that you're testing, you'll find that you either have to declare it as a separate class to not, because the action you're doing before in JUnit is not going to be valid for other test cases sometimes, right? That's the problem. And JUnit is not structured, it's flat, so you're still going to see this, even if you achieve this in JUnit, you're still going to see repeated test names everywhere, just because it's flat. You don't nest anything. And that's how properly structured Spec would look like. Sometimes so it really depends. So the test we saw in the beginning was really giant. With such test cases, if you have lots of them in JUnit, Spec will start drastically reducing your lines of code. In simple cases, it will be roughly the same. So I wouldn't measure the lines of code as a primary target here, but it could be an interesting one in large projects. And you can structure your test code. And you can start applying all those principles that we discussed before and not being a hypocrite to yourself, So this is how the test reporting looks like in the IDE. This is actually from Spec 1.x, because we haven't finished the IntelliJ plugin for 2.x yet. But the thing here is that IntelliJ for a long time already supports this hierarchical test report view. So we just use that. And you will see whenever some test fails, you will be able to click through all of that. And you will be able to click expand me everything, expand failed. All that works. And all that makes sense instead of reading all that super long test names which have multiple assertions in them, and you don't know which one failed. With Spec, you actually find yourself not really, you just click on the stack trace to just fastly go to there, or hopefully in Spec 2.x, we actually should be able to navigate you directly to the test location just by clicking here. So I don't remember myself looking at the stack traces that much with Spec, in compared to JUnit, where I do it on a regular basis. So we're almost done actually here, and I just have some couple tips for you on how to use Spec. One of the most important Spec aspect here is that since it's just a bunch of Kotlin code, it's not gonna, you don't have to annotate anything. It's not discovered statically, it's discovered dynamically. You can do lots of dynamic stuff, and one of that is iterating over some test values that you need. So for instance, we want, let's say, test string extensions in Kotlin. And what if I want to check that is null or blank function works properly for null, for empty string, for space, for tabulation, for something? Well, you can do this in JUnit, but only for strings and integers, something that's available at compile time. In JUnit 5, they have a way to plug in custom factories of values. And guess what? You just need to copy the method name and put it in some annotation, or just give it directly to test runner. So it's going to be reflectively discovered. And it's like you copying the test name into some string. Here is just Kotlin code. I'm just creating a list. And for each of it, items, I'm just creating a bunch of groups and assertions as I want, which is impressive. And you can test all your enums, all your states, all your cross configurations. It's basically like a test matrix, but written as a code, so developers can actually understand it instead of relying on magic properties of some test framework that you declare you're going to use this list, and I don't know how you're going to combine them. What if I have different amount of items there and there? Here, you just write this logic yourself. We don't force you to use any structures here. Another tip that I don't have a slide of is that if you find yourself needing to test a complex object or a function that has many dependencies, which is a common case scenario, right? So instead of declaring lots of memoized, what you can do, like you can declare memoized for every dependency, right? Which is valid technique. What you can do is just extract a class, call it like a test environment, and just create an instance of it as a memoized. So that's like just technique to save you some boilerplate here. So that's mainly it. Really encourage you to not try other API yet, because we're gonna refactor some of it, and some of it is really for more like unsafe state sharing, which is a separate topic. So when to expect the spec to be available? So I'm going to give you a month to grow this idea in your mind and working with tests every day that your tests are maybe awful, maybe not. So you naturally will come to the conclusion that I'm going to try Spec. And hopefully at that time we will already release 2.x. But yeah, we will try to target developer preview by the end of this month. Mainly, we need to focus on IntelliJ plugin for now, and just make sure that our stuff is ready for multi-platform. Most likely, multi-platform will be the whole feature of 3.x, but most of the support is actually already there. Yeah. So this is where it lives now. We decided to move it out of JetBrains because it's not official JetBrains project. Although we, in some future, expect JetBrains to start using this heavily inside their own tests because we're gonna use it. We're gonna make it multi-platform. And yeah, basically that's it. I also would say that it's just maybe it's just my way, but the way I learn about projects, I just follow them on GitHub instead of starring them. It's like starring is basically for projects that I'm afraid that I will forget the names of. But when you follow stuff, you actually much faster get all the context of how this is working under the hood. It's interesting, how the multi-platform stuff works. So I would encourage you to follow it instead of starring if you want. And I'm available here. I will probably tweet something about it. Most likely, yes. Another reason for this talk actually is that because I now work at Lyft, and we now face exact same problems with exact same JUnit tests. So I was giving internal presentations of that, a test run, and now people at Lyft also when. So but it's developed as completely open source project, not related to any organization. The license is BSD, which is very good license. It just wants you to mention the project, and that's basically it. And we don't want you to release your stuff to the open source if you don't want, although we encourage you. All right, so that's basically it. And also that's all the other core team of Spec. Oh, do I need to click on everything? Jesus Christ. OK, so that's basically all the other core team of the Spec. Oh, I totally forgot. We have a Slack channel and Slack chat. OK, so it's called Spec. You can join it, but I want to say that version 1.x is currently not actively maintained because we focusing all our forces on 2.x. So just grow this idea in your mind for a month. Give us some time to release it. And I believe you will be very happy to try to write your own first specs, and then you will find yourself rewriting JUnits as crazy at night because you just want to do it. So yeah, I'm also open for questions. I will repeat them. So if you have any, yeah, feel free. Jesus. You were the first, I think. Yeah, sorry. Okay, okay, yeah. So is context of group names have to be unique? That was a bug in Spec 1.x. We did some weird state sharing because we were relying on the group naming. Now it doesn't have to be unique.
So when we want to test RxJava,
right?
How would you test it? Do you have to create a test subscriber?
Yeah. How would you test RxJava with Spec? So we test lots of RxJava, and we tested lots of RxJava with Spec. And it's like one of the perfect combinations. So what do is you just declare your target observable as, like test, basically, the subject under the test as a memoized, as you want. And you just create a test subscriber out of it. Depends on what is lifecycle of your observable. You can just directly declare a test subscriber out of it and just don't care about observable and just have separate assertions as you want. Or you can do whatever you want because it's just a code. But yeah, usually you just declare a test subscriber as a memoized, basically, yeah, and you just test against that. Yep.
Are there any observations in adding syntax sugar to asserts,
Okay, are there any plans to add syntactic sugars for assertions? That is a point I totally forgot to say. Spec does not enforce any assertion libraries, any mocking stuff. It's totally up to you guys. One of the reasons for that is, we don't want to, and there are frameworks that do that, and not everyone is happy with their decisions. I don't like, let's say, Hamcrest assertions. I like AssertJ more. Or there are people who like fluent assertions in Kotlin that are in infix functions. So we don't do any enforcing here. And there are libraries that are going to be multi-platform as well. So we're just going to be part of that family for them.
So Jasmine, the front-end
yeah.
framework, it has you can put F to only run a certain test or X to hide a certain test. Is that functionality in Spec?
Okay, the question was, there is a framework for JavaScript called Jasmine, which looks very, very similar. Because as I said, Spec is not unique here. It's just port of those concepts made in a nice way. And there is a thing called focus that you can put F before that group name or the test name, and the framework will only execute this particular part of the test tree. This is made for, when you have large Spec and one of them fails, you don't want to waste your time or looking through the report when you only focused on this one. So in Spec pre-1, we did have that. Then it was sort of removed because we made a IntelliJ plugin that had run button near to every group in Spec. But then some people just like to run tests from command line. So there is an issue for that we're gonna add it, and it's assigned to me, yeah. So yeah, it's gonna be there. I also think it's very useful, just pretty nice. Yeah? So the question was, do we plan to support XML-compatible reporting for CI, let's say, as JUnit, because JUnit reporting is basically a standard everywhere? No, because it's supported by JUnit 5 that we use as a reporting engine on JVM. So it's already supported, yeah. So, yeah.
So you built a lot of stuff on top of JUnit 5.
Right.
But right now, and still, Android is based on JUnit 4S. As I heard from Google engineers, they have no clear plans about whether they will support JUnit 5. So what are your thoughts about it?
All right, so the question was, because Spec 2.x uses JUnit 5 as a report engine, what is the current story with Android? Because Android Gradle plugin 3 still doesn't support JUnit 5 natively. If it won't, we're going to make our own support because we care about that. There is an Android JUnit 5 plugin, third-party one, and it actually works with Spec as well. And hopefully we will just be able to reuse, reference people and with proper documentation on how to set it up for Android. Because we use Spec heavily on Android, so it definitely possible to do. We just want to make it as straightforward as possible in 2.x. So yeah, this story gonna be covered one way or another. We don't really care what Google thinks about it. How do you do mocks in Spec? Assertions and mocking is not covered by Spec, so you can just use Makito, Easy Mock, Power Mock. Regarding Power Mock and Rob Electric, actually, those are frameworks that require custom class loading. And Spec 1.x, it was basically impossible to use. In Spec 2.x, we already planned the hooks for such things to inject their class loading at the proper time. So you will be able to use nasty things like Power Mock and Rob Electric as well. OK, there is a guy who wants to use Spec right now. I gave you a month, man. All right. Spec 1.x works. The problem is that it started depending on, early on the early version of JUnit 5, which then created, you can find too many issues of, different versions of JUnit breaking us. So there is no single guide telling you how to, most properly support it, set it up in your projects. Yeah. I mean, the reason why we don't want to publish developer previews right now is because we don't want to, this experience of breaking people, It's too many breaking, and people just, I'm tired of that. I'm tired of writing my tests. So, OK, try 1.x. We will try to start publishing developer previews as soon as possible. Sorry about that, yeah. Parallel test execution. So we, as of JVM part of it, we fully rely on the JUnit 5 integration to the build systems. So if the integrations support that, we just discovered, it's definitely possible to run different specs in parallel. It will be a little bit harder to run one spec in parallel mode. It's still, I think, possible, definitely. But on the level of, let's say, spec classes, yes, it's possible. And we just didn't build it into the framework itself, although I see all the ways to do that if we would just consider that. OK. The question is, are we going to support Android instrumentation tests? This was a hard story for Spec 1.x and pre-1.x, because it was basically sort of working, but not. Android bundles own JUnit 4, and that was breaking us because we were relying on JUnit 4 at that time. Currently, Android supports Java 8 starting from Oreo, so if there are enough APIs that JUnit 5 uses that will make it work on Android directly, that means that Spec should work for the most part, yes. Yep. Oh, OK. So I think that's over. Thank you very much, guys.